Waleed, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're very busy, and we just wanted to take some time to speak with you because in the sixth year of the Khayrallah Prize, you are one of the two winners that we chose this year. And it was an absolute delight to see the film and to award you. And what we'd like to do today is just spend some time with you to get to know you better and allow those who are watching this video to get to know you and your work. And I'm going to start with something very simple and straightforward. I was wondering if you can tell us, about your childhood, about growing up, about where you grew up, and the experiences that, in essence, led you on the path you're on.
Absolutely. Firstly, I really want to say how amazing the news was that I got this award and how much it means, because it's, yeah, it speaks to our roots. Where do I come from? Well, I'm completely a child of Lebanese diaspora, really, in a way, though I've spent time between Lebanon and the rest of the world. I was born in Liberia, went to school in Lebanon, in elementary school for 3 years, then had to travel back to Liberia, spent some time in Europe, then went back to Lebanon. The war kept me between Liberia and Lebanon just growing up. In a way, yes, when you tell people this, everybody's like, oh my God, these two countries. And at the same time, yes, these two countries, but looking back, I wouldn't do the work I'm doing right now if I wasn't that, if those didn't create me, the challenges. And then, so born in Liberia, raised between Lebanon and Liberia, did my undergraduate in Lebanon at the Lebanese American University. At the time, it was Beirut University College. It was amazing, and I loved it. And then moved to the US and did an MFA in film. I wasn't sure if I was going to stay in the US, to be quite honest. I just decided to come to Los Angeles on a road trip because, as growing up, you see films about road trips and you wanted to do the road trip across America. And I did that, and we ended up in LA. And here I am. I'm still here. I mean, within the first 2 years, I ended up co-producing and editing a first feature that I did, which was at South by Southwest. And then I kind of knew, like, ever since I was a kid, I kind of wanted to tell stories in a way. Like, I was very obsessed with stories and TVs. And it's very funny because my parents would point it out when I was a kid, like, because I would read films very differently or TV very differently than they would. And I would explain a lot of the underlying things. And then when I came to LA, yeah, I trained as a writer director. I started writing here and to try to make films here. And somehow something told me that the first film that I wanted to be to direct has to be Lebanese. At the time, I didn't have the story. I would dabble with writing short stories because I also had aspirations to become a short story, like to get published as a short story writer or a novelist or something like that, which is very close to film in my opinion. And I did write a collection of short stories. 1982 was one of them. And it was really horribly written as a short story. It wasn't really very good, but somehow in 2010 I was in a conversation in Paris with a very dear friend, Rita Daguerre. She was in acquisitions at a company at the time called Wild Bunch in France, and then we started talking about where we were in 1982, because she was in Lebanon, I was in Lebanon. I had just seen this Israeli film called Waltz with Bashir, which addresses this period. And it dawned on both of us that there has never been a film from Lebanon that addresses our experience. And I'm not the type of person I mean, I was very fortunate in that I've never had to bear arms, and I grew up in a very pacifist family. We do not believe in violence. And my experience of the war was always as the citizen that's not participating in the war, which is the majority of the Lebanese people. And our story has never been told. And in this context, that story had to be told for several reasons. And then it took me a year to decide, okay, I'm going to write this. And then I wrote it. First draft immediately got into the Sundance Lab, which was like just fresh off the presses. And then it took about 5 years to finance because people were afraid of the subject. They're like 1982, Lebanon, Lebanese perspective on the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. There was a lot of people who really just, even in Hollywood, who were like, just kind of took a step back. They're like, wait, what are you trying to say here? and they very few people understood what I was going for, which is I was going for one. I do not think that the wars 1982 happened and we're still exactly where we were in 1982 today. So it really is the fact that wars are never the answer, which for me is the epitome of why we are where we are today. And I felt it was necessary to tell this story on that front because our narrative has never been told and nobody in Lebanon talks about it. Our history, because kids, my nieces and nephews have no idea what happened in 1982. So when this film happens, it created a conversation between my mom, my generation, and the kids. And they're like, oh, okay. So it was very interesting because it created an intergenerational dialogue that for me was one of the intentions, because we should not forget our past, but we should learn from it. And the irony of it all, when I finished the film and we were trying to distribute it in Lebanon, we got resistance from the censors, which is kind of very surprising. It's like, why? They're like, because we do not want to remember and nobody should know about these dark times. Because at the time, when one really digs deep, you see it's not about who was warring on our land as much as it's also about the schisms that we had within our society, which are very important to discuss, so you get past them. So anyway, so finally we got through that and we managed to get the film to be seen there. But it's really, so that was what propagated that narrative. And for me, it was very emotional and I felt it was very important. On top of that, I live in Los Angeles. I've worked in Hollywood for 20 years. I do music. I've done a lot of, I've been fortunate to have a very beautiful and diverse career in the music, documentaries and everything. And I realized that we are really not represented. Like even when someone tells you I'm making a film about Lebanon, I felt like we were not represented. Even films that are coming from Lebanon, I feel like the most representative, there's not a lot of films that are representative. They somehow seem to have a pandering in terms of like how we're expected to be, how a light is expected to be shed on us. And for me here, I kind of needed to debunk all of that. I needed to show us who we are, for who we are on every level, which somehow I did it with my short film, which was shortlisted for the Oscars just out of the blue. so when I did that film, a lot of people, they're like, this is Lebanon, this is how you live. Like, because people are not used to seeing themselves in us as well. Because every film that we see that comes from Hollywood or anywhere in the world for that matter, most of the places, you kind of look for yourself in the material you see. And then if you're not looking for yourself, if you don't see yourself in the material, then your emotions kind of move from, are less empathetic, but more simple, like you feel like sorry for people. Like, and I needed to show us in the light of who we are to each other, who we are to the world, and how similar we are to the world. Because no matter what, even in the most conservative society in the world, an 8-year-old boy or a 9-year-old boy will have a crush on a 9-year-old girl, whether they like it or not. This happens, it's normal, it's who we are. And people were not used to seeing that. And I think that's where really, for me, it's important to show us for who we are. I mean, that humanity in us, and I wanted people to meet us as Lebanese people. And being an expat and having lived most of my life an expat, you always have to explain who you are to people because they assume something. And then when they meet you, they're like, wait, what? So this film does a lot of the explaining without us having to do anything. It just shows a moment in our history. But what's more important is that it shows how we dealt with each other in that moment of our history rather than how we dealt with everybody else. And that we have the same problems as a society, and our construct is very principled, and we have moral compasses, and we have everything, which people tend to forget, especially given the state of the world today, the state of the news today. It's like I wanted to transcend news, transcend these images that are always propagated about Lebanon, about the Middle East, about who we are. Even right now in Ukraine, I mean, it's repeat here. There it is. It's repeating itself. So yeah.
I want to talk more about the film, about the nuances of the film, about the reaction to the film, and its impact, as you would. But as a historian, I want to unpack some of your story and go back a
Yes,
little bit and just kind of
absolutely.
take it apart and then delve a little bit deeper, especially for those who are watching this to get to know you. So you said you kind of grew up between Liberia and Lebanon, and I assume here is high school years where, as well as elementary school, so you would go back and forth.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about your parents before we get to you. What how did they end up in Liberia?
My father, my father's story is pretty fascinating. My father, I think, and if memory serves me, he dropped out of school when he was 12, and then, but he was kind of a very ambitious child. At 19, he had a cousin who moved to Liberia, and then he moved to Liberia, and then kind of he was entrepreneurial, and he sort of built himself really. I grew up to the consciousness that my father spoke 5 languages and traveled everywhere, and he was very fluent. And we grew up with the notion that, listen, I didn't have the education because I couldn't have the education. So if anything I'm going to do, I'm going to give you this. And then my mom is from Zahle in Lebanon. My father was from Hazmiya in Beirut, and my mom was from Zahle. And then they kind of had crushes on each other. I mean, my mom saw my dad when she was 14, and then they got married when they were 23. And then we just happened to be born in Liberia. But what was very interesting about that is when I was 7, and at my older brother's request, we decided that we saw some movie and we saw boarding school, and my brother and I were fascinated, my older brother and I, and we told my parents that we wanted to go to boarding school. So they sent us to boarding school in Lebanon in 1979. And I was in boarding school at, I can't imagine it now. I mean, it's like, what? And my mom, I'm like, Mom, how did you do that? She's like, you guys wanted it. And at the time in Liberia, there wasn't a lot of good schooling. And what was really important for my mom and dad is that they really were keen on us never disconnecting from our culture, from our language. So that's why we kept going back and forth. And we were lucky in that when there were problems in Liberia, we were in Lebanon. When there were problems in Lebanon, we were in Liberia. Where there were problems in both places, it was like, on which boat are we? So, which happened. So that's that. So, and then my father was, he just, yeah, I mean, that's kind of it.
So,
Yes.
which boarding school did you end up in Lebanon? Just out of curiosity.
High School.
Well, this is really quite remarkable because that's where my brother went to school, where I wanted to go to school. And my mother is from Brumena, so Brumena High
Okay.
School was like this place. So you went there in 1979,
Uh-huh.
and all my cousins went to Brumena High School, and you probably were with some of them.
Yeah.
They're from the Aswad family anyway, because
Oh,
their
I know
parents
the
ran
Aswad
away.
family. I remember the Aswad family only
Yeah.
too exactly.
So I'll
Yeah.
have to mention this to them. But so you were there in 79, which of course is quite remarkable because Lebanon was in the throes of violence. And
Mhm.
so were you there in 1982?
I was.
Okay.
I was there 79. I was in boarding school, and then my parents decided that they didn't want to keep us in boarding school, and therefore we basically just, my mom came back to Lebanon, and then we were commuting in the 80, 81, 81, 82, and 81, 82 we would take the bus home. And really, the film 1982 is literally lifted from my memory of that last day of school in Burmana High School. It's also where I shot the film.
Uh,
So
so in essence, really, that was the question I was going to ask, if there's an autobiographical element to
very
the
much
film,
so.
given that very much so.
Very much
So
so.
how old were you when
10.
you were there? You were 10.
10. I was 10.
So
Yeah.
you were a very young child.
Yeah.
And what happened after, the invasion, the Israeli invasion? Did you leave then to Liberia?
3 weeks after that, we left. Yes.
You left.
Yeah. And then we came back. I came back in 86. And then
Okay.
I finished high school and then went to undergraduate in Lebanon. And then after undergrad. And then in 1995, I came to the US. So,
Okay.
yeah.
And your brother, he also followed a similar
Yes.
trajectory?
My brother stayed in Lebanon, but he did travel. Yeah, he came back to Lebanon in 1980, a year before me, 1985. And then, of course, then there was another war in Lebanon. Then during these periods, we kept just going back and forth every time there was like some crazy skirmish going on. And yeah.
So, it's kind of as I'm a bit older than you are, but I lived through the Civil War as well as a teenager, a few
Yeah.
years ahead of you. And, there are these survival mechanisms
Mm-hmm.
to create a sense of normalcy amidst the abnormal, a sense of stability
Yeah.
amongst the exploding. And I'm kind of curious, was film or plays or writing or novels or reading, I mean, how did you create a sense of normalcy in essence for yourself?
As a kid,
Yeah.
I mean, I think we were we were living, it was interesting because our parents really tried everything in their power to be normal and to pretend normalcy and to shield us from everything. And this is sort of reflected a little bit in the film, because the adults keep trying to convince you and themselves that things are going to be okay, but then they're not. And then you kind of, at one point they can. So in between, I mean, this is kind of goes to the core of what this film is about as well, because in every war, in every place where there's conflict, the goal is to pretend or to give kids a sense of safety and a sense of normalcy, right? And growing up in Lebanon, though, I mean, in retrospect, maybe it wasn't normal, but at the time for us, our problems were normal. And we knew that our parents were dealing with things that we don't know about. We watched TV all the time, but then of course at the time we didn't have TV 24 hours a day. So we had, we would wait for stuff to see. We would see Starsky and Hutch, and we would see like Grandizer, which I'm sure you've watched, which is actually has a lot to do with the a small sub narrative in the film. So it's like so all of that. I mean, those are things. I mean, we had the same things that the rest of our parents did, everything to make sure that we had the same things that any child almost in anywhere in the world was able to have. And it's in the Lebanese psyche as well to kind of keep us open and keep us connected, even though at the time there wasn't the internet, there wasn't everything. But the interesting thing is, even in the worst of situations throughout the war, if a song dropped in the UK in the Billboard Top 40 in the top 40 in the UK, in top of the pops, then it was like that moment it came down, it was available in Lebanon. It was kind of crazy. In spite of all of that, there was, I mean, even as a kid, I was obsessed with waiting for the charts on the BBC World Service when I was a kid. I was like 10. I would like find the AM channel so I can actually listen to it, the shortwave actually, even at the time.
Right.
So it was pretty, I don't know where this came from, but that's sort of like, I never felt a deficit, I would say,
So you mentioned when you were describing your childhood that early on you showed a proclivity towards film, and not just to watch, but to really kind of analyze, take apart, understand, and put back together. It's almost like taking a clock apart mechanically and putting it back together. And I'm kind of curious if from your childhood, what kind of films sort of really kind of became part of this kind of growing up experience.
As a child, in 1976, so which means I was 4 years old, my father had ordered a VCR to Liberia. It was, and I think there were only two of them. One of them was in our house, and it came with a bunch of Betamax tapes. And my father was like, "Oh my God! So now we have a cinema at home." At the time, because that's what VCRs were, and there was only one cinema in Liberia called Relda. And I do remember particularly two like the few things. Like basically, my dad used to love the Three Stooges, so he had tapes and tapes and tapes of the Three Stooges, which we would watch over and over and over again. And then Roadrunner cartoons, of course, like endless, Wally Coyote, the poor guy. and then also I particularly remember The Wizard of Oz, watching it for the first time because that was one of the films. The Sound of Music was huge because my mom loved Julie Andrews at the time. And then The Wizard of Oz, and then there was The Incredible Hulk. somehow we managed to have episodes of the Incredible. So, and we didn't have a lot of them, but we would watch them over and over and over because it's like you only had so many, and you didn't have TV on a Saturday, so you would just be up to stay and watch this thing over and over. And then there was a video club, and then it would be like, and then suddenly I would end up watching like. I remember watching The Exorcist for the first time, being like, "What is going on?" Being so scared that I couldn't sleep, and then Jaws, and all of these films, they sort of stayed with me as a kid. We didn't have access to anything in Lebanon when we were in Liberia, and then I went to Lebanon, of course, and then that was a whole other. The TV was big in Lebanon. I didn't see like Lebanese films until like the 80s. And then I was like, there was something that I used to do, which was, I don't know how that came to my mind, but I used to go into like, I don't know how old I was, but my mom can tell you this. I would go and get saran wrap and like draw figures on it and get a light bulb and put it in a box. And then, but I didn't know what lenses were. So I would put the box and put the light by the saran wrap, and I would force they would humor me, so everybody would come, and I would just keep pushing the box closer and closer and closer to the wall until it's that close to the wall, just so you can actually see what I drew on the saran wrap through the light without a lens projected on. So it was like, I don't know where that came from, but that sort of told me something, told them something, and then over time, I just started watching really boring films. So not boring. I mean, for me, I was in love with them, but my dad would be like, "What are you doing watching this film over and over?" Like I remember in my teenage years, like I would watch like this film called Baghdad Cafe over and over and over, and my dad was like, "What is wrong with you? Why are you obsessed with this film?" And it was just one of these. It's just one of these things that, you know, I don't know why, it just spoke to me, you know. And I think that's sort of how I developed the language and the propensity to tell stories. And of course, I wanted to write a book. So when I was 13, I ended up spending the whole summer trying to write a novel, and, you know, those normal fun stuff.
Well, I mean, normal to a certain extent, but certainly this is kind of like an early prodigious child, somebody who has clearly talents for storytelling. So from there, you would kind of jump forward to LA, and you're doing your Masters in Fine Arts. Is that where you did your MFA?
I did my MFA at Florida State.
Florida State. Oh, sorry.
Yes, and then I drove out with a bunch of friends.
Oh, that's right. Okay, I remember this. That's true. The car crossing the United States, storytelling. So what? I mean, why Florida State? Just kind of out of curiosity, why?
Why Florida State? That's an interesting thing because I applied in 4 schools. I applied to UCLA, USC. I applied UCLA, Florida State, NYU, Columbia. Okay, I didn't get into Columbia. I got into NYU. I got into Florida State. I didn't have the money to go at the time. You know, the war in Lebanon had just finished. I was working at Future Television, which is like making $500 a month. So that's not going to get me to $70,000 to have in my bank account. And I wasn't sure I was going to make it, to be quite honest, to get my MFA. And then I I was literally, and at the time in Lebanon, we didn't have international phone lines. And I knew I needed to let the university know if I was going to come or not. And then we had to go to Central, where you basically pay and you call anyway. So, and I called the university, and then they answer, and they're like, "Oh my God, we've been trying to reach you." And I'm like, "Why?" They're like, "We just want to let you know that we gave you a 20% scholarship. And towards your master's, and then we can do something, you know, when you get here." And I was kind of like taken aback because I wasn't expecting that at all as a foreign student to get it. They're like, "Based on your interview, and, you know, we felt that you can actually do this," and they're like, "We're going to give you a teaching assistantship," which is great. I mean, this is just like, as a foreign student, this rarely ever happens. So, and at the time there was the center in Lebanon called Amid East, which helps students, and they're like, do you know anybody at the university? Like, how did you do it? How did you? I'm like, I don't know anybody at this university. Like, so that basically, the moment that started to happen, it almost eliminated NYU because it was kind of, there was no way I was going to have $70,000 or going to ask my dad for $70,000 to send me, just because in a few years before the Liberian War broke out, and my dad at the time had reinvested everything into a new form of business. And so it was pretty brutal when the Liberian War happened. And then we lost contact with my parents for like about 6 months, didn't know what was going on. And that was before cell phones, before, anything. But anyway, so okay, so great. So I decided to raise money in order to close it. So I started doing fundraising at the time to make it to my graduate school program. As I was doing this fundraising, I tried to go as much, and then the deadline was approaching where I had to tell them yes or no, and then basically and then I didn't have the money, and then I walked back, and I remember walking with my brother, and going to the centrale again to call them to tell them, can I keep the teaching assistantship and that, but I needed to push my attendance by 1 year just so I can. Okay, and we've been trying to reach you again, and they had increased my scholarship. So I was like, of course, that completely changed everything. And then I hung up, and my brother Wissam was like, this is a sign, you need to go. And this is my younger brother giving me wisdom, and it's amazing because he was like 16 and he was like 17 and I was like 22. Anyway, but that's how I ended up in Florida State, really. And then when I came to Florida State, it was very interesting because I really had a major culture shock. Coming from Beirut, even though it was Beirut, I felt like the cultural, there was very little going on that was stimulating for me in Tallahassee, because it was a very, very sleepy town. It's a college town. Couldn't find the books I liked, couldn't find everything I had to order. So, but it was interesting because it put me into an interesting vortex, in that I'm not in a city. I am in what is pretty much a rural part of the United States. And as a matter of fact, I just thought that the nature was absolutely wonderful. And in retrospect, having gone to Florida State and knowing what I think it has given me. If I went straight to New York or to LA, I don't think I would understand the United States the way I do now. Because being in a place that's conservative, that's rural, and that where you're actually not only it's kind of like it has both sides of the American sociopolitical divide. For me, was the most enriching experience. And then even in my work at Florida State, like I felt like I came out that much more understanding of the fabric of this nation, of the United States. So anyway.
So upon arrival in LA, I mean, you did this road trip, the kind of iconic road trip, and you arrived there, and you said earlier that one of the things you weren't really thinking about filmmaking as much as writing, because that was another passion. But so what is, just kind of, how did you kind of get into this filmmaking situation? You just finished a filmmaking school at Florida State. And I mean, were you arriving with notions of what your life is going to be?
I had no idea. I thought I was only going to be here for a year, and I was going to get like the experience, a year, which is the optional, the practical training that you get after you graduate from university. And then after that, I was going to go to Lebanon or to some other country. I didn't really have a plan because I didn't have a script written that's sellable in the US. So, but when I came, I mean, there was an alumni infrastructure that was that wasn't very big. It was very small. So we all kind of knew each other and we all started working together. And then in addition to working together, I ended up getting an internship at a company called Blue Tulip, which had an agreement with Fox at the time. It was Jan de Bond's company, had done Twister and Speed and all these like really sort of high intensity films. And it was interesting because my job was as a reader, really. I would read and I'd do coverage and all of that. So I kind of knew I wanted to stay in film, but I wasn't ready to jump into directing because I didn't have anything that I wanted to say. Because I think as a director, you need to have something to say, not only something, but where my strength was, I felt I also had the strength as a producer. So So I kind of decided that I will pursue both tracks until I'm ready to cross over. And I think producing and directing for me, unlike what many people think, is very close, because I embed myself in any project, whether I produce it or direct it or do anything on it. It's for me, and then and then basically I really met people, and then I ended up somehow meeting this other producer who saw me as a PA, and then he called me. He's like, I'm doing an independent film. Do you want to come and work on it? And he had seen my short film from grad school, and he loved it. And he's like, what do you want to do on this film? And I told him I can coordinate. And I'd never coordinated a movie before. So I jumped immediately into coordinating. And then I ended up realizing that because Florida State has such a good program in terms of field training, I was able to really shore up all the wherever there was any shortcomings on the production. I managed to shore it up. I was fairly ambitious, pulled the project together, got the trust of the director. At the end of the day, ended up overseeing the film. There was an editor who wasn't really understanding what the director wanted. I ended up taking over and re-editing the whole film, and then that just kind of started. In the meantime, the producer who had brought me on to do this independent film also was he's of Lebanese descent. His name is Louis Nader. And he was a huge producer in the music video world. Like, he worked on Scream, Michael Jackson, all of that. And so that opened me up to the music world. And then that's also when I undertook starting to work on music videos. And I moved in that world very, very fast. So, and I ran a company for about 5 years that produces commercials and music videos, while at the same time doing documentaries. I worked with David LaChapelle on the Elton John show in Las Vegas. Audio Slave. That led to, and I did Rise, this really glorious film that David directed, where I basically formed the film in the edit completely. And that made Sundance. We were also shortlisted for the Oscars in 2006 with it. I think that just by nature of things, like project after project after project, I just decided not to be quiet. Like, if I had something and I had the conviction to go after it, or to state what I wanted, or to see how I could help a project, then I would absolutely do it. I never stopped myself. And that really just built over and over. And then ultimately I had, I worked with David Bowie. I had the honor of working with David Bowie. It was the most incredible 3 days of my life when we were preparing for that, because we were isolated in the house, me, David Bowie, and Tilda Swinton, and Floria Sigismondi. So that was like, okay, it was sort of an honor. And then, of course, Annie Lennox, where I produced her last concert that she did live, as well as the visual record on her Nostalgia record, for which also we were nominated for an Emmy.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So it's like, I think you just do the work. And if you're speaking truth to your work, it will go where it wants to go, So
I mean, it's a remarkable career, and clearly a rich talent that, kept blossoming. But here's, I want to get back to something you said about 1982, the film specifically, in which you said it took a while to convince people that we need to fund it. But what I'm kind of curious about, and I understand the hesitation as you described it, which is people thinking, who wants to deal with this issue. But then you land somebody like Nadine Labaki, who is quite a remarkable actress and director and producer herself. She's really quite an incredible talent and very well known for many things. So I'm kind of curious how that collaboration came about, and how you imagined who should be playing what, and how you sort of went about casting.
I went about casting the adults very different than the kids. With Nadine, I actually shared the script with her at the end of 2013, where I felt I had, I knew I was going to have a challenge financing the film. So she read the script, she loved it. And what was interesting is we are of the same generation, so our experience is pretty identical. But before approaching Nadine, I had actually watched almost everything that she had acted in before. We had met socially a couple of times, but we weren't really friends per se. We were just acquaintances. And then basically, as I was figuring out who would play this person, it was very clear for me that Nadine had something that is unspoken that this person embodied, like that I wanted that character to have how I was seeing the character. And she loved the script. She said yes, and then we just literally left it at let's see how it goes, you know. And then I went off for 4 years. I mean, we kept like kind of interacting socially, you know, on and off, and we had some common grounds and common friends, etc. Then I wasn't even sure if this. I mean, some people were telling me just give up. Literally, I was told by people who were even part of the producing team. They're like, okay, well, it's not going to happen. So we're not going to be able to close this. And so by the time the film came about, it was 2017. She was in the throes of editing Kafanaum, which was her Oscar-nominated film. And I knew she was like in the throes of it. I just thought she would say no. She'd say like I told her, I'm like, Nadine, we're good to go on this. So do you want to still do this? She's like, let me reread the script, Walid. And she reread the script and she clearly loved it. And she's like, when are your shoot dates? Let me know. And because I knew she was very tight on time, and Nadine is really incredibly talented. She's also a workaholic. Clearly, I mean, as her work speaks for itself. I mean, she doesn't stop. She's go, 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 you know? I mean, we're kind of very similar and very different in that we both like, once we're immersed, we're immersed. So she's like, okay, I gave her the dates and I just thought it was really amazing because the dates kept shifting for us. And then when the dates landed and I told her what the dates were, and the dates were exactly when she was taking her vacation. And she said, I'm taking my vacation, Walid. I can't give you my entire vacation. I can give you about 12 to 15 days. I'm like, that's more than enough. So that's how it ended up being. Collaboration-wise, she was the most incredible actor to work with as an actor because she's also a director. And so there was a lot of shorthand in direction with her. Like Nadine, like she knew, like whenever we needed to do an adjustment, it was a given. It was very direct, very quick, and she understood profoundly that character. We did not tell the kids that Nadine was playing in the movie until she appears in the classroom, and everybody was like, oh, this is Nadine Lemaki. So that was the funniest moment ever. And I'm like, Nadine, you really have to be the teacher, because if I can't control them, you just need to yell and like them. It was kind of really, it was really kind of it was pretty phenomenal. And then I mean, I think her being a part of this with the classroom also brought the kids up to a certain, you know what I mean? So there was, and she made it very clear. She's like, Walid, I'm an actor here. I'm not a director. And she made sure she wanted to give me the freedom to be able to address her as an actor and not as a director, even though in my mind, we are peers. And it's pretty amazing because also she's a humanist in her work, and we're both humanists and we're both anti-war. We're both, you know, so there's a common language in the purpose of the work that we do, you know.
So how did you then cast the children, the young school kids?
The young school kids, they're all non-actors. But I had been going to Lebanon for the few years before, like 2014, 2015, 2016. Like I would literally go for a month or two every year. And I had a friend of mine, his name is Mike Evazian, who's part of the casting team, but wasn't active during the shoot, who was instrumental in giving me a window into the lives of these kids. So I would go, he would teach drama at different schools, different classes, different everything. And the idea that I always had from 1982 is, though the film takes place in Brumana High School, I was intent, and it was very important for me that I build a classroom that is very mixed as well, mixed religion, mixed class levels, mixed everything, that is sort of a very much, I would say, microcosm of the country. Once we decided to move, I mean, it's not, when you're casting kids, you can't cast kids like a year before. You have to find them, cast them, shoot them, because they grow so quickly, especially in that age group. So we got greenlit at the end of April, okay, in mid-May. And then immediately I needed to start the casting before a full green light to know that I have the kids. And then during that, it was 3 weeks of intensive. We went to about, I don't, countless schools, I don't know, all over Lebanon. And we saw about 700 kids whose parents have cleared them in their school environment for us to just view them and observe them and meet them. From those, we came down to about 200. From the 200, those who came came actually to the office with their parents for a second, more intensive casting. From those, we went down to about 30, and those 30 I took into a workshop. And the workshop was not like a regular workshop. It wasn't like come and like do exercises. A workshop was really about building camaraderie, watch movies together, talk, do exercises, trust exercises, hang out. That was what it was. Until 3 weeks, halfway through the workshop, I decided the roles. Like there were 3 Wissams, there were 2 Joannas, and whoever was not a part of whoever did not get one of the main speaking roles was still in the classroom. So what happened is we used this workshop to create this camaraderie between the kids, which is an energy that you feel on the set, that you feel when you're watching the film. You feel that these kids already know each other and they're already clicked. So I never told anybody to click with anybody. We just observed and let the classroom clicks and loyalties build each other, while we worked, where everybody knew exactly what they were. Even when we went to the location, the last week, which was fittings and last final exercises and whatnot, like we went to the school, we knew this, like each person who was part of this classroom had his locker about a week before. So every time they were in the school, even when we're not shooting in the classroom, they would put their stuff in their locker. They knew this was their desk. So there was sort of this world in their minds that was somewhat complete, that they had a school feeling. And then, to be quite honest, the kids I was very lucky. They were incredible. Like I learned from them, and I had to become them, and I had to become their friend, and they had to stop thinking of me as a director, and they had to be able to tell me when I'm wrong. And I gave them that license. And whenever I was telling them to do something, that they knew that if I told them to do something, and this was one of the first things I told them, if I'm ever telling you to do something that you wouldn't do, you need to let me know. So, and this was really what gave us this result, because there were moments where Wissam was like, Walid, like the moment, there's a beautiful moment in the film. It's not as readable on the small screen, because in the big screen though it is, which is basically when the kids run towards the fence and as the tanks are passing. That was not me, that was Wissam in the middle of the shoot, because we had shot it and it was a huge day and there were tanks rolling around, and I'm doing this, and then finally Wissam's like, Walid, like really, can we talk about something? I'm like, what? He's like, I think if we were playing in this playground and these tanks, I mean, we wouldn't stop, we would run towards those, we would run towards the tanks and towards the fence, like we wouldn't stay put. And I'm like, you're right. So I told my light producer and my production, I'm like, we need to rotate the tanks again. That, in Brahmana, that means you have to go all around and back up and come back down. So it was like, and we had to redo the sequence, because basically it was his idea. It wasn't my idea. My idea is like, they see it, they're frozen, they don't run as they're playing soccer. Whereas in the film, I mean, this was Wissam, it wasn't me. But like, I had to be honest to what they would do as kids, and I had to trust them. And that's why the film is the way it is.
It's truly remarkable, actually, how natural the kids were. I mean, the classroom seems so real. I mean, even knowing it's a film, I'm still looking at the classroom. Remember, I've watched it a couple of times, and it looks like you just came into a regular classroom and you started shooting, and people were behaving. It almost looked like a documentary rather than actually acting in the sense of feature length. So I think you did an outstanding job. And the idea of the workshop is really, and that makes a lot of sense to me, and that's brilliant in many ways. To make them feel like this is a classroom, this is your natural way of being. It's really quite something. I mean, go ahead.
One of the things that I did, which was kind of unusual, is basically I scheduled films for them to watch as well, where we would watch the films together. Like we watched The Goonies, we watched The Rifle, the short film that I did, which was Oscar shortlisted. We watched My Life as a Zucchini. Like we would watch these films, And as a matter of fact, and I'd have them lead discussions on the film, and have that I had them figure out how to discuss to hear their opinions about what these other kids are doing acting wise, why they like them, why didn't. I didn't put any words in their mouth. And when I put them in that position of them being empowered to discuss and assess what they're seeing on the screen, they owned it. And that's amazing. And this was like the biggest gift. So
Just quick question about the crew. Was the crew primarily American crew that you took there, or was it all
it's
from
all
Lebanon?
it was all from Lebanon with the exception of the director of photography. So apparently at the time there wasn't a director of photography that was in Lebanon that was available for the shoot. And then because my initial intention was to have the entire crew be Lebanese. And then yeah, so that was, so the only person who's not Lebanese is the DP.
So here's where I'm kind of curious about how you situate yourself, because I mean, you really said it eloquently that you are a true child of the diaspora, in which you kind of your life moves all over the map, as a lot of Lebanese immigrants and other immigrants' lives are. We don't go from point A to point B. We seem to go along this network of life. So were you, as you were making this film, to recapture, a autobiographical moment in your life, and obviously Nadine Lebaki's life as well, it turns out. Were you thinking that you're doing this as a Lebanese director or as a director?
Very good question. Actually, I was doing this film primarily. That's a very tough question to answer. I mean, because I don't separate my Lebanese-ness from my directorness, but I was making a film for the Lebanese people. I did not care what anybody else would think about the film. For me, the most important thing about the film is that this film speaks to the Lebanese people. And that was part of where this goes to a very interesting narrative story, which, if I may, like when you're making films, basically a lot of films get made in Lebanon, very few in the Middle East, as a matter of fact, or in a lot of the Francophone countries, I would say, because they're supported by by certain funds, and those funds generally find a sort of sensationalism in the way they view Lebanon. It's Orientalism, or any other country, and in this case, that I didn't really like. I never structured the film so that I would to satisfy those tastes or those prerequisite requirements. There was a point when one of the potential producers who was joining the film comes to me and he's like, Walid, like, it would be so much easier to fund this film if you move this and put the film in Beirut and in a poor school, like literally in a school that doesn't have a lot of money and all of that. And I'm like, that's not the film I'm making. That's one. Two, it was shocking. I mean, ultimately we didn't end up working together, but this was a request that came because he felt that if I fit this cadre that they needed, that they're expecting to see, then great, then I would get, it would be much easier for them to raise money. And I didn't really care to change that because and what people fail to see is that at the time, I know Lebanon today is different from the Lebanon of 1982, but in 1982, the majority of the country was middle class. And the majority of the country was actually pretty affluent and comfortable financially. It was a very affluent society up until that year. So for what people are used to seeing, they're like, wait, what? It's confusing, And anyway, so that's sort of that little story.
I'm so glad you shared this story with us because it's a question that is on my mind, both about your own work, but also larger about Lebanese filmmaking and Arab filmmaking, perhaps one could say, as a whole. Is this idea of funding? Obviously, funding is critical to any cultural productions. Far too often we create this, pastiche in which you just see the product, but you don't see all the hard work, all the blood and sweat and money that it requires to do something of quality. I mean, we forget that, and somehow as if things kind of pop up in the open on their own. So I'm kind of curious as to where you see the future of Lebanese cinema, given the limitations of funding. As somebody who's kind of straddles both worlds, really.
To be quite honest, I mean, I think Lebanese cinema right now is I know we have a horrible situation in Lebanon, but as a cinema, there is so much happening, and I think there's become an awareness of this Orientalism, the resistance to this perception, and a lot of the filmmakers are actually doing films because telling stories the way they want to tell them, regardless of what the West wants or expects or is ready to fund. There's a couple of films. There's a film that I was associated with that I tried to raise money for in the US, and nobody would give us money. And the film ended up getting made by this phenomenal director. And it won in Berlin. It won in Berlin last year. It won the Teddy, and it's an incredible film. It's like one of the most powerful Lebanese documentaries ever made. But very few people will see it, unfortunately, because it's a pretty polemic but very honest and blunt documentary.
What is it? What's the name of the film?
It's called Miguel's War. It's a very, very special, very powerful, it might polarize people and it might anger people, but when things are honest, it does that. I do think that lately also, I mean, you have a movie called Memory Box, which is about to also come out by Rana and Khalil, and that movie for me is really sort of a brother to 1982, because it really goes into who we are. It doesn't seek to create any sort of people feeling sorry for Lebanese people, but rather people understanding us and feeling with us and loving and getting their hearts broken with us. I mean, it's a very, very strong film. So I am actually very happy with the diversity that's going on. I think it's tougher, but I had the strength to actually stand my ground. Rana and Khalil had to stand their ground. So is Eliane in her documentary. She stood her ground. She's like, this is the film I'm going to make. I don't care. And she did. The younger filmmakers that are going to be reliant on funding, I think they sometimes feel that they have to skew their stories in order to satisfy expectations and tastes that funds are looking for, which is, I mean, it's a tough balance. It's a tough balance, but that's when good producers come into play as well. Like, you really have to stand your ground. And I think we do have stories to tell. And there's a lot of amazing filmmakers in Lebanon. It's amazing. Like per capita, it's actually, I mean, to be honest, last year we had 5 incredible films come out of Lebanon, 5. And they're all very, very, very good. Okay. In a country this small, in the US, we make 3,000 films and we only find 5 watchable ones. So the per capita is, there's way more talent in Lebanon than there is here. So it's very interesting. And I think people are determined to tell our stories. The tough part is, how do we show our stories? Like with 1982, with all of the successes we've had, it's been very tough to get people to watch this film, so, but slowly, like we're working towards that, It opens in Canada on April 1st, and we're trying to open it in the US in May, theatrically, because the film needs to be experienced in a theater.
Of course, absolutely. And I mean, I think distribution is another one of those chokeholds that becomes very difficult to overcome, especially for not Hollywood mega, films. So I really appreciate the difficulty in that. And I, obviously those who are watching this documentary, I would say that you have to watch this film.
Yeah.
You must. It's one of those films that you have to watch.
Yeah.
And we hope, Oualid,
Yes.
we hope that we will bring you here in the fall, and we'll have a live screening of the film and a
I would love
conversation with
to.
you.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a large enough, not only Lebanese but non-Lebanese community, more importantly, I would argue,
Yeah,
that is
exactly.
here, that we would love for you to come in the fall, and that's what we would hope to do.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of talk a little bit about your future projects. Couple of ways I want to talk about them. One, clearly you're, a remarkable director and producer too, as well, a filmmaker in general. And so I'm wondering if you are, you are indeed in a place where you are a mentor for a lot of upcoming talent in Lebanon, because you're right, Lebanon. So that's one aspect of the question is, your relationship to creating that mentorship, to cultivate that talent and guide them through the labyrinthian world of filmmaking. But two, I'm kind of curious about your own personal filmmaking, about where you're going next, if you have any ideas that you can at this point share.
Yeah, I'm not at liberty to fully share, but I do have a few projects in the works. Actually, I have it might be a US project before a Lebanese project up next. but it's a pretty intense, tough US film. So we'll see if that goes. There's some US projects that are Middle East centric as well that I'm developing that are very, very important, I think, important subject matter. I tend to be very big on the socio-political, but without being political, sort of as 1982, where it's basically. And then I have a Lebanese film that is a story of a family. So, but the tough part with me in Lebanon is it's too close to home. It takes me a minute, and at the same time, it's not like I'm a storyteller. I'm sort of a dramatist. I would tell like 1982, for example, is a story of a boy, 11-year-old boy who has a crush on a girl in his class and wants to tell her they love her. Yes, I mean it's simple, but it's not particularly quote unquote original. It's not about, I mean, it's about how the film is made and how the story is told and how the characters are weaved. And my next project will be in that same thing. It's just it's a much broader story though. So, yeah. So.
Well, listen, Walid, I mean, I look forward to watching every film you ever make.
Thank you.
I've become a fan.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll start a fan club at this point because it's truly kind of the film, as I said earlier, because of its quiet to a certain extent, storytelling was remarkable because I thought it told the story so powerfully because of that quiet, very contained filmmaking that almost appears as if it's ordinary, but in fact, it's an extraordinary film. It's not. And you capture that so beautifully because I think far too often when we have films about the civil war in Lebanon or any violence, there's a pornography of violence that overwhelms the storytelling. And like you said, an Orientalist lens that renders us as either victims or terrorists, not as fully, human beings with everything. And you capture that. You capture that in this kind of very normal end of the year scene. So I look forward to seeing everything that you make, and we look forward to having you, come to NC State at some point
in the fall. It'd be great.
Yeah, indeed. And I want to wish you all the best in all your future endeavors. And thank you again for being with us today.